45 days without hearing another human voice. And the thing I lost first wasn't courage or hope or sanity. It was my sense of smell. I didn't notice until day 19, when I cracked a tin of sardines that should have hit me like a wall, and instead registered as nothing oil on metal. Texture without meaning. By then, my world had contracted to the circumference of the lamp's beam, and I was already someone I wouldn't have recognized 6 weeks earlier. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is the lighthouse. Cape Morrow Light sits on a granite stack 11 miles north of Buckfeld, Maine, connected to the mainland by a tidal shelf that surfaces twice daily for roughly 90 minutes each exposure. The shelf is flat, mostly loose stone and bladderwrack, and at peak low tide, you can walk it in 22 minutes if you don't care about your ankles. The lighthouse itself is a conical rubble stone tower, 61 feet to the gallery rail, with a keeper's cottage attached at the base that lost its roof in a nor'easter sometime in the 90s. Nobody repaired it. The Coast Guard automated the light in 1987 and decommissioned it entirely in 2014. What's left is the tower, the iron cottage shell, the underground cistern, and a diesel generator that somebody forgot to remove. I knew the place because I'd spent 3 summers contracted to do the masonry restoration. My name is Jonah Kittredge. I was 34, a marine mason by trade, the specific kind who works on structures that get hit by salt water year-round. Seawalls, bridge piers, lighthouses. I knew how to point lime mortar in a gale and read a tide table the way most people read a clock. I knew Cape Morrow stones better than I knew the apartment I rented in Buckfeld. I did not go there because it was the safest place available. I went there because I was a coward who recognized a door he could bolt. The outbreak reached coastal Maine on a Tuesday. I know that because I was repointing the harbor breakwater in Buckfeld when the harbor master, a man named Angus Tidewell, who had been giving me work for 4 years, walked out of his office carrying a VHF radio in one hand and a shotgun in the other. He didn't speak to me. He walked past my scaffold, climbed into his truck, and drove north without closing his office door. I stayed on the scaffold for 11 minutes. I know this because I was mixing a batch of NHL 5 lime putty, and the working time on that mix is exactly 14 minutes before it begins to set. And I watched it go stiff in the bucket while I listened to sounds from the village that didn't belong to a Tuesday morning. Car alarms, breaking glass, a scream that started high and ended wet. I left my tools on the scaffold. I drove to my apartment. I loaded my truck with every canned good in my kitchen, the 2 5-gallon water jugs I use for mixing on remote sites, my tool bag, my sleeping bag, and a crowbar. Then I drove to the access road for the Cape Morrow tidal shelf. The tide was going out. I had 90 minutes. I drove across the shelf at low speed, stones popping under my tires, the mainland shrinking behind me. I parked the truck inside the roofless cottage, carried my supplies into the tower, climbed the stairs, and bolted the ground floor door from inside. Then I sat on the spiral steps halfway up the tower and listened to my own breathing and waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. That was the worst part of day 1. Nothing happened, and I was glad. I need to explain what the lighthouse gave me, structurally, because the 45 days only makes sense if you understand the architecture of the isolation. The tower has 4 usable levels. Ground floor, a circular room 10 feet across with the bolted iron door, the generator housing, and a fuel store. First landing, a room the same size with a camp cot, my supplies, and a single porthole window facing east. Second landing, the old watch room with windows on all sides, 4 of them, each about 18 inches wide, set deep in the stone. This is where I spent most of my time. Third level, the lamp room, glass-walled, with a decommissioned Fresnel lens still mounted but dark. And above that, The open gallery platform with its iron rail. The cistern is underground, accessed through a hatch in the ground floor room. It collects rainwater from a pipe system Tidewell had maintained out of habit long after the lighthouse lost its keepers. When I arrived, it held roughly 600 gallons, more than enough for one man for months. The generator ran on diesel. I had the fuel remaining in its belly tank, maybe 40 gallons plus whatever was in my truck's tank, which I siphoned on day 3. Total fuel, around 75 gallons. Enough to run the generator, sparingly lights, the small electric heater, charging a battery lantern for perhaps 60 days if I was disciplined. I did not turn on the main lamp. I want that understood clearly. The Fresnel lens stayed dark. I used only interior lighting, low wattage, and only after nightfall. During the day, the tower had enough natural light through its porthole windows that I needed nothing else. What I did not have, a working radio. The VHF set in the watchroom had been stripped years ago. No antenna, no power supply, no handset. I had my cell phone, which lost signal on day 1 and became a useless rectangle by day 4 when the battery died. I had no way to transmit and no way to receive. This is important. For 45 days, I had no information from the outside world. Everything I knew about what was happening came from what I could see through the watchroom windows and from the behavior of the tidal shelf. The shelf told me the most. On day 2, during the morning low tide exposure, I watched 3 people cross from the mainland side. They moved wrong. I knew it immediately, the way you know a wall is unsound before you test it. The way you know a stone is frost damaged by the color of its face. They moved with a rhythm that didn't account for the uneven ground. They didn't look down. They didn't adjust their stride. They walked as if the surface were flat, and they stumbled continuously. But the stumbling didn't slow them or redirect them. They kept the same heading. They were walking toward the lighthouse. I watched from the second landing window. They made it perhaps a third of the way across before the tide began returning. The water rose over the shelf in that fast, silent way it does on flat ground, 1 inch, then 3, then a foot in what feels like seconds. The 3 figures didn't react. The water reached their knees, and they kept walking. It reached their chests, and they kept walking. Their heads went under, and they did not surface. The tide covered the shelf, and the lighthouse was an island again. And whatever those 3 had been was now at the bottom of a 40-foot channel. I sat in the watchroom and tried to feel something about what I'd seen. And what I felt was this. The math works. 90 minutes of exposure twice a day, 11 miles from the nearest town. A tidal channel that drowns anything that can't time its crossing. I was safe. I was completely, obscenely safe. The first week established a routine that I recognized, even then, as psychological scaffolding, something my mind erected to replace the social architecture it had lost. I woke at first light. I descended to the ground floor, checked the generator fuel level, ran it for 15 minutes to charge the battery bank, then shut it down. I drew water from the cistern, 4 liters, measured in a gallon jug with a mark I'd scratched with my masonry chisel. I ate 1 meal in the morning, 1 in the early evening. Canned goods, cold. I inventoried my food supply every 3rd day. Between meals, I worked. This is the part that kept me sane longer than I probably deserved. I am a mason. I think in terms of structure, load, and weather penetration. And the lighthouse, even after my 3 summers of restoration, had persistent moisture issues on the north face where the prevailing storms hit. I had my tool bag. I had leftover lime putty components in the cottage. I had time, so I spent my days repointing mortar joints. working my way around the tower's interior at the ground floor level, then the exterior at whatever height I could reach from the gallery platform. Careful, patient work. Rake the old mortar, clean the joint, pack the new mix, tool it smooth, wait for it to cure. A good mason can do perhaps 12 linear feet of repointing in a day, working properly. The lighthouse had hundreds of feet of joints that needed attention. It was absurd. The world was ending, and I was maintaining a building no one would ever use again. But the work kept my hands busy, and my mind in a state I understood the focused, semi-meditative condition of repetitive skilled labor, where your body knows what to do and your thoughts can run without becoming dangerous. I watched the tidal shelf during both daily exposures. I saw more of them, the walking ones. Attempt the crossing 3 more times during that first week. 7 total, in groups of 2 and 3. None made it. The tide took them all. They didn't learn. They didn't wait. They simply walked when they reached the edge. And the water did what water does. By day 7, I had counted 7 drowned on the shelf, and seen approximately 20 more gathered at the mainland edge of the tidal flat, visible through my binoculars as a loose cluster that shifted and regrouped without apparent purpose. They seemed drawn to the site of the tower, or to the memory of a path. I couldn't tell which, but they gathered, and each day there were more. I calculated, at peak low tide, the fastest walking speed across the shelf would require roughly 22 minutes. The window of full exposure was 90 minutes. That left a comfortable margin. But if enough of them entered the shelf simultaneously, some might reach me before the water returned. On day 8, I began timing their walking speed with the marine chronometer I'd found in the watchroom Angus tidewells, left behind like everything else. They moved at approximately 1.3 miles per hour on the uneven stone. The shelf crossing was 0.4 miles. That meant 18 minutes, minimum, for the fastest of them, assuming a direct path without stumbling delays. In practice, their stumbling added 6 to 8 minutes, 24 to 26 minutes total. The math still worked, but it was closer than I liked. On day 9, I made my first modification to the lighthouse's defenses. Not a barricade, the iron door was already more than sufficient. Instead, I removed the lowest 12 rungs of the exterior maintenance ladder that ran up the tower's north face from ground level to the gallery. I used my cold chisel and a hammer, working during a high tide when the shelf was submerged and nothing could approach. I knocked the bolts out and let the rungs fall. The remaining ladder began 23 feet up the tower's face, unreachable without climbing equipment. It was a reasonable precaution. It was also the first time I made a decision that assumed I would be here for a long time. Days 10 through 20 were a slow compression. The crowd at the mainland shelf edge grew. By day 14, I counted over 60 through my binoculars. Not a herd in the way I'd later learned to think of them, but a persistent gathering that thickened each day like silt depositing at a river mouth. They came from the direction of Buckfeld. Some wore clothes I recognized the orange vest of a road crew worker, a blue postal uniform, a red jacket that might have belonged to the woman who ran the diner on Main Street. I couldn't see faces clearly at that distance. I'm grateful for that. They attempted the crossing in larger numbers now. At each low tide, 8 or 10 would enter the shelf simultaneously. The leading ones made it further, halfway, sometimes 2/3 before the returning tide swept them under. But on day 15, 2 of them reached the cottage. I was in the watchroom when I saw them emerge from the water's edge on my side of the channel, seawater streaming from their clothing, and walked directly into the roofless cottage where my truck was parked. I heard them hit the truck. The sound carried up through the tower stones, a dull metallic impact, repeated at irregular intervals, like someone testing a surface without understanding what testing means. They stayed in the cottage for 3 hours. Then the next high tide pushed a surge through the cottage's open door frame and swept them back off the granite stack. I watched them tumble in the current and vanish. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the camp cot on the first landing and listened to the wind and the sea and recalculated my margins. The problem wasn't one or two reaching my side. The ground floor door was iron, bolted from inside, set in a frame I'd personally remortared with NHL5 hydraulic lime 3 summers ago. Nothing short of a vehicle or sustained battering would breach it. The problem was accumulation. If enough of them crossed during a single low tide window and stayed if the tide didn't pull them back, they would mass at the tower's base. And eventually, mass becomes pressure, and pressure finds weakness. I needed them to not reach my side at all. On day 16, I began working on the shelf. This is the part I'm least proud of, and also the part that kept me alive. During the morning low tide, when the shelf was fully exposed and the crowd was visible on the far side but not yet advancing, I descended to the tidal flat with my tools and began dismantling the walkable surface. I'm a mason. I understand stone. The shelf is natural granite, but its surface had been improved over a century of lighthouse keepers, flat stones laid like crude paving, a footpath maintained through generations of use. I pulled those paving stones up. I created gaps, drops, unstable sections. I made the already treacherous surface worse. Not impassable for someone with coordination and intent, a living person could still cross carefully, but significantly harder for something that couldn't adjust its gait or look down. I worked in 20-minute sessions, always leaving myself enough time to return to the tower before the tide turned. Each session, I disrupted another 40 feet of path. By day 20, I had broken the shelf's surface across its entire width for a stretch of approximately 100 feet, centered at the 1/3 mark where the deepest natural channel ran. The effect was immediate. The next time they tried to cross, the leading ones hit my disrupted section and fell. Not into water, the tide was still out, but into the gaps and drops I'd created. They didn't get up efficiently. They piled. The ones behind walked into the ones who'd fallen. Within minutes, a tangle of bodies blocked the path, and the returning tide swept the whole mass into the deep channel. None reached my side for 11 consecutive days after that. I stood on the gallery platform and watched them drown in the channel I'd engineered, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not guilt, not horror, nothing. The same nothing I'd felt when I watched the first 3 go under on day 2. That absence of feeling is what I want you to understand about day 20. Not that I was brave or clever or surviving well. I was stone. I had become the material I worked with. Hard, dense, indifferent to what washed against me. On day 21, the generator failed. Not completely a fuel line blockage, probably sediment from the diesel sitting too long in the belly tank. Fixable if I had the right filter. I didn't. I jury-rigged a bypass using a length of copper tubing from my tool bag and a piece of cheesecloth as a crude filter element. And it worked well enough to give me another 10 days of intermittent power. But the incident sharpened something in my calculations. I was not going to be rescued. I understood that intellectually from day 1, but the generator's cough made it physical. Everything here was finite. The diesel, the food, the cheesecloth filter that would clog again, the lime putty that would run out, even the cistern water if it didn't rain. It hadn't rained since day 12. I began rationing more aggressively. 1 meal per day instead of 2. Generator running only 5 minutes for battery charging, once daily. No heater. October in Maine, in a stone tower with no insulation. The cold crept in by the 3rd week and settled permanently. I wore every piece of clothing I owned and slept inside my sleeping bag with my boots on. The cold affected my hands. This mattered more than comfort. My hands were my working tools. Mason's hands need to be flexible and sensitive. Numb fingers can't feel the consistency of a mortar mix or gauge the depth of a raked joint. By day 25, my fine motor control was diminished enough that I stopped the repointing work. Without the work, the days became longer. I tried to fill the time with other tasks. I inventoried my food obsessively. I cleaned the watchroom windows with seawater carried up in a bucket. I disassembled and reassembled my tools. I studied the tide charts I'd found in Tidwell's logbook, handwritten tables going back to 1978. Beautiful in their precision, useless for anything except confirming what I already knew. But without the physical work, my mind began moving in directions I couldn't redirect. I thought about Ira Selwick. Ira was a friend. That word is insufficient, but it's the accurate one. We worked together for 6 years. He was a diver, a marine salvage specialist who did the underwater work that complemented my above-water masonry. When a seawall needed foundation repair, I did the visible pointing, and he did the submerged structural work. We weren't close in the way that implies intimacy. We were close in the way that two people become when they depend on each other's competence in dangerous conditions. 7 months before the outbreak, Ira drowned during a salvage operation off the outer islands. A current took him under a wreck. His airline tangled. By the time his surface tender realized something was wrong, he'd been down too long. I was on the boat. I was his surface tender. I was the one who should have been watching his airline, and I wasn't, because I was on my phone arguing with a client about an overdue invoice. No one blamed me. The inquest found equipment failure, a faulty valve on his regulator that may have contributed to his inability to free himself. But I knew. The 14 seconds between when his line went slack and when I noticed those 14 seconds were the difference between pulling him up in time and pulling up a body. I hadn't said this to anyone. Not to the inquest, not to his wife, not to the grief counselor the company provided. In the lighthouse, with no work to fill my hands and no voice to fill the silence, those 14 seconds expanded until they occupied the entire day. By day 30, the smell of myself no longer registered. I'd mentioned the loss of smell beginning at day 19. But it wasn't really smell that vanished, it was distinction. Everything carried the same flat mineral scent: stone, salt, cold metal. My own body, unwashed for a month, existed in that same register. I was becoming the tower. This wasn't metaphor. It was observation. I noticed it in small ways. I stopped distinguishing between indoor and outdoor time. I would find myself on the gallery platform without remembering climbing the stairs, standing in wind that should have sent me back inside, feeling neither cold nor discomfort. I stopped tracking meals by hunger and tracked them only by the chronometer. I stopped looking at the mainland crowd. They were simply weather. A feature of the landscape no more remarkable than the tide. On day 32, I realized I hadn't spoken in 23 days. I tested my voice. It emerged thin and unused, like a tool left in salt water. I said my own name and it sounded foreign. I said, Lighthouse, and the word had no more meaning than the wind. I said, Ira, and felt the vibration in my chest like a crack propagating through stone. That night, I did something I hadn't done since arriving. I climbed to the lamp room, the glass-walled chamber at the top of the tower, and sat beneath the dormant Fresnel lens and looked out at the dark Atlantic stretching east without limit. And I thought clearly, for the first time since day one, about what I was actually doing here. Not surviving. Surviving was incidental. The food and water and tide calculations were mechanical behaviors, reflexes of a body trained to solve structural problems. What I was doing was waiting. Waiting for the isolation to become unbearable enough that it felt like punishment. Waiting for 45 days or 60 days or 90 days to feel like penance for 14 seconds of inattention that killed a man I was supposed to be watching. But it wasn't working. The isolation didn't hurt. That was the terrible realization of day 32. I was comfortable here. The routine sustained me. The solitude asked nothing. The lighthouse was exactly the right shape for a man who had failed at the one moment that required his attention. It was a place where nothing would ever need him to pay attention again. The dead couldn't reach me. The living didn't know I was here. And I could exist in this stone tube, maintaining its walls, counting its tides, eating its stored calories, until the food ran out or my body failed or the ocean finally rose high enough to swallow the tower entirely. And none of it would ever require me to be responsible for another person again. I sat under the dead lens and understood that I wasn't punishing myself. I was rewarding myself. The lighthouse wasn't a prison. It was exactly what I wanted. And that understanding that I preferred this, that the death of the world had given me the excuse I needed to become what I'd always been moving toward, was the first thing in 45 days that actually frightened me. Day 36 brought the rain I'd been waiting for. A nor'easter rolled in from the Atlantic, with wind that made the tower groan in its mortar and rain that hammered the gallery glass hard enough that I could hear each drop as a distinct percussion note from the watchroom below. The cistern began refilling. I could hear the pipe system working, water channeling from the collection surface into the underground tank. By morning, I estimated I'd gained another 100 gallons, enough to extend my stay by weeks. But the storm also brought something else, a change in the tidal shelf. When the weather cleared on day 37 and I climbed to the gallery with my binoculars, I saw that the storm surge had rearranged the stones I'd disrupted. Not repaired them, the paving was still broken, but shifted the rubble into new configurations. Some of the gaps I'd created were now filled with storm-deposited debris. The broken section was no longer a clean obstacle, but a rough, uneven surface, still difficult. But not the impassable trap it had been. The crowd at the mainland edge had changed too. Larger now, well over 100, but distributed differently. They were no longer gathered at the shelf's starting point. They had spread along the entire shoreline, facing my promontory, standing in the surf, some of them waist-deep in water that should have been too cold for any living body to tolerate. And on the shelf itself, during that morning's low tide, I counted 11 of them already past my disrupted section. Moving slowly, stumbling, falling, rising but moving, making progress. I calculated quickly. 18 to 26 minutes, I'd estimated before. With the storm damage partially filling my traps, the fastest of them might now reach my side in 30 minutes. The low tide window was still 90 minutes. That left 60 minutes of exposure after the first arrival. I descended to the tidal flat that morning and worked for my full 20-minute window, rebreaking what the storm had repaired, widening gaps, pulling stones. But I couldn't undo a nor'easter's work in 20 minutes. The shelf was worse for them than it had been. Originally, no paved path remained, but it was better than it had been after my 2 weeks of systematic destruction. That evening, during the second low tide, 3 of them reached the cottage. I heard them below. the sound of bodies against my truck's metal, the sound of hands, or what had been hands, scraping against stone walls. They couldn't enter the tower. The door held easily. They circled the base and scraped and pushed with the mindless persistence of water against rock. And I sat in the watchroom and listened and told myself the math still worked. The tide returned. I heard the surge enter the cottage below. The scraping stopped. When I looked from the gallery in the morning, the base was clear, but they had reached me. For the first time, in 24 days, something dead had stood at my door. Days 38 through 44 became a war of mathematics. Each low tide, more of them crossed. My disrupted section slowed them, but no longer stopped them. The storm had given them not intelligence, not strategy, but a changed terrain that their senseless persistence could now navigate. They fell. They piled. But the ones behind climbed over the fallen, and some percentage made it through. I went out every morning and worked on the shelf, breaking stones, widening gaps, even digging where I could with my chisel and hammer to deepen the channels between rocks. But I was one man with hand tools, working in 20-minute windows, against an ocean that rearranged my work with every storm, and a tide that delivered new debris twice daily. By day 40, between 6 and 12 of them reached my side during each low tide window. They gathered at the tower base, scraped at the door, circled the cottage, and were swept away when the tide returned. But the returning tide was less thorough. Now some of them had found positions against the tower's stone base, where the surge didn't fully reach. They wedged themselves into the angle where the tower met bedrock and remained after the water receded. By day 42, 4 of them were permanent residents at my door. They didn't sleep. They didn't tire. They scraped at the iron with a patience that made my repointing work look rushed. The sound traveled up through the stone, a constant, arrhythmic rasp that became the tower's new ambient noise, replacing the sea sound I'd grown accustomed to. I stopped sleeping through the night. Not because of fear, I still trusted the door, still trusted the stone, but because the sound wouldn't let me enter that deep unconsciousness where rest actually happens. I dozed in 20-minute intervals, jolting awake each time the rasping shifted pitch or rhythm. My food supply was at 40%. The diesel was nearly gone, 5 gallons, maybe less. I'd stopped running the generator entirely, relying on the battery bank's remaining charge for my single lamp. When that died, I'd have only the marine chronometer's glow and whatever daylight the portholes admitted. Day 43, morning low tide. I counted from the gallery. Over 30 of them on the shelf at various stages of crossing. 8 more at my base, joining the 4 permanents. 12 total, pressing against the tower, the cottage, my truck. The sound from below was no longer rasp, it was pressure. Collective, compounding, structural. That evening, I heard something new. A sound I recognized professionally. The sound of mortar cracking. Not the door, the stone beside the door. The joint between the second and third course on the ground floor's north face, a joint I had repointed myself 3 years ago with NHL 5. A good joint, well tooled, properly cured. But lime mortar isn't concrete. It's designed to be sacrificial, to crack before the stone does, to absorb movement and moisture, to fail gently rather than catastrophically. It was failing gently now. Under the sustained, mindless pressure of 12 bodies leaning against it continuously for days. I went down to the ground floor and pressed my palm against the interior wall. I could feel it. A vibration not dramatic, not threatening, but present. The wall communicating through my hand that something was asking to come in. I had weeks of food, I had water, I had a structurally sound tower with a door that would hold for months. But I had mortar that was cracking. And I had a crowd on the mainland that grew every day. And I had a shelf I could no longer keep impassable. And I had a truth I'd been avoiding since day 32. This place was not a prison, and it was not a penance, and it was not a reward. It was a coffin I'd chosen, because choosing a coffin was easier than choosing to live in a world that might need something from me. Day 44. I made a decision. I decided to leave. Not immediately, I'm not impulsive. I spent day 44 planning. The problem was straightforward. I needed to cross the tidal shelf going the other direction, toward the mainland, during a low tide window, past the crowd gathered at the far edge. Every piece of logic said this was suicide. But I began thinking like a mason instead of a prisoner. The shelf's exposure wasn't uniform. The eastern edge away from the normal approach path, around the promontory's far side, had a section I knew from my restoration work. A narrow shelf, barely visible at low tide, running along the base of the cliffs rather than across the open flat. It was submerged at all but the very lowest tides, the monthly spring tides that coincided with new and full moons. I checked Tidewell's charts. The next spring low would occur on day 46. The exposure window would be longer, perhaps 2 full hours, and the eastern shelf would drain just enough to walk, single file, pressed against the cliff face. The crowd gathered on the western flat, where the traditional path began. I had never seen any of them on the eastern side. They seemed drawn to the path, to the memory of a walkway that had existed for a century. The eastern shelf had never been a path. No living person had used it regularly. There was no residual pattern to follow. It was a theory. It might be wrong. If it was wrong, I'd be on a narrow ledge between a cliff and a 40-foot channel with no way back except through them. But staying was also a theory, the theory that the door would hold, and the mortar would crack slowly, and my food would last, and the crowd would stop growing. And I no longer believed that theory. I packed a bag. Food for 3 days. Water for 2. My binoculars. My chisel and hammer, the only tools that might function as weapons, though I had no illusion about their effectiveness against a crowd. I wore my boots, my heaviest clothes, a waterproof jacket. I did not pack sentimentally. I left Tidewell's logbook. I left the chronometer. I left my sleeping bag and my extra clothes, and my empty fuel cans, and the truck that had no gas, and the cottage that had no roof. I left the lighthouse. Day 45. The day everything changed. I woke before dawn. The spring low tide was calculated for 06:18. I descended to the ground floor in darkness, feeling my way down the spiral stairs I'd climbed 1,000 times. The door rasped from the outside. They were still there, the permanent ones, pressing against the iron. I could hear their weight against it. I didn't go to the door. I went up, to the gallery, to the outside platform. In the dark, in the wind, in the last hour before dawn on day 45. I climbed over the gallery rail and onto the exterior face of the tower, the north face, where I'd removed the ladder rungs. I lowered myself by handholds I knew from 3 summers of masonry work. Finger-width joints, protruding stones, iron bolts where the old ladder brackets remained. 23 feet of free climbing in the dark, down the tower's face, to the bedrock on the promontory's east side. Away from the door, away from the crowd. I dropped the last 6 feet and landed on wet granite and stood perfectly still, listening. The rasping continued at the front of the tower. They hadn't heard me. The wind was coming off the ocean, carrying my sound away from them. I crouched against the cliff base and began moving east. Toward the narrow shelf that would drain in, I checked the sky 40 minutes. I made it to the eastern edge of the promontory and crouched behind a boulder and waited for the tide to drop. The sea was dark gray, barely distinguishable from the sky. I could hear the shelf beginning to surface, the sucking, draining sound of water retreating over flat stone. At 06:14, 4 minutes early, the eastern shelf broke the surface. A narrow strip of rock, gleaming wet, pressed against the cliff wall, perhaps 3 feet wide at its broadest, slick with weed. I began walking. The eastern shelf was worse than I'd calculated. 3 feet wide at its broadest, but that breadth was inconsistent. In places it narrowed to 18 inches. In others, tide pools interrupted the surface, forcing me to step through ankle-deep water that might or might not conceal a deeper gap beneath. The cliff face to my left was vertical and rough, good for handholds, bad for speed. To my right, the shelf dropped away into the deep channel where I'd watched dozens of them sink over the past 6 weeks. I moved slowly, a mason's pace deliberate, weight-tested, each footfall confirmed before transferring balance. The sunrise was beginning behind me, turning the sky from gray to a cold amber that reflected off the wet stone and made everything simultaneously more visible and more deceptive. I could see the mainland ahead, not the western flat where the crowd gathered, but the eastern shore, a rocky coastline backed by dense spruce forest. I'd worked a job there once, years ago, a private dock restoration. I remembered a gravel road that connected to the county highway about 3 miles inland. The shelf crossing to the mainland edge was approximately 600 meters along the eastern route. At my cautious pace, I estimated 25 minutes. The tide window was 2 hours. The math was comfortable. At the 300-meter mark, I saw movement in the water. Not on the surface, below it, in the deep channel to my right, where visibility extended perhaps 10 feet into the greenish Atlantic water. A shape moving along the bottom upright, walking on the sea floor, arms drifting in the current like kelp. It was 30 feet below the surface and 20 feet from the shelf edge. It wasn't climbing toward me. It was simply walking, following the seafloor's contour, heading in the same general direction I was heading. As if the underwater path and my surface path were parallel routes, and we were travelers going the same way. I stopped watching it. I kept moving. At the 500-meter mark, the shelf widened to nearly 6 feet, and I allowed myself to increase speed. The mainland shore was close now. I could see individual trees, individual rocks. The cliff beside me was lowering, transitioning from vertical to a steep slope I'd be able to climb. At the 550-meter mark, I heard it. A voice. Human. Alive. Don't come up here. I froze. The voice came from above, from the top of the slope where the cliff met level ground. A woman's voice, low and urgent. There are 4 of them in the tree line directly above you. If you come up where you're heading, you'll walk into them. I pressed against the cliff face and looked up. I couldn't see her. The angle was wrong. The slope obscured the top. "Who are you?" I said. My voice came out broken. 45 days of silence had left it barely functional. "Keep going another 100 meters. There's a cut in the slope, a drainage channel. Come up through that. It's clear." "How do you know?" "Because I cleared it 20 minutes ago. Move." I moved. Not because I trusted her. Trust had become an abstraction, a word from a language I'd stopped speaking, but because her information was specific and her tone was competent, and I had no better option. The drainage channel was where she said it would be. A natural gully cut into the slope by decades of rainwater, wide enough to climb through, choked with dead ferns. I scrambled up, my pack catching on branches, my hands scraping against roots and loose soil after 6 weeks of touching only stone. I emerged at the top of the slope and found myself on a narrow strip of level ground between the cliff edge and the spruce forest. And standing 10 feet away, holding a fishing gaff in both hands like a staff, was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a face that looked like it had been outdoors for every one of the 45 days I'd been inside. "You're the Lighthouse man," she said. Not a question. Her name was Brid Summerlin. She said it like it was information she was providing reluctantly, a transaction she'd prefer not to make. "I've been watching your light," she said. "Not the big one. You never turn that on. The small one. Your porthole glow at night. I could see it from the ridge." She gestured inland, uphill, toward where the spruce thinned on a visible ridgeline. "I thought you'd come out eventually, when the crowd got big enough." We were moving through the forest. She walked ahead, the gaff held across her body, stepping over roots and deadfall with the automatic precision of someone who'd been navigating these woods daily. I followed, trying to keep pace, my lighthouse-adapted legs protesting the uneven ground after 6 weeks of spiral stairs and flat stone. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Since before you. I live up here." She said it flatly. "Lived. Still live. The house is on the ridge." "Alone?" She stopped and turned and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Assessment, maybe? Calculation. "My husband died in the first week," she said. "In town. He'd gone to the hardware store." She resumed walking. "I've been alone since day 3. I absorbed this. 42 days alone in a house on a ridge, watching a lighthouse glow at night, watching the dead accumulate on the shore, choosing not to contact me, choosing not to signal or call out or make herself known until I appeared on the shelf this morning. "Why didn't you come to the lighthouse?" I said. "Why would I? You had your place. I had mine." "But you watched." "I watch everything. It's how I know where they are and aren't." She pointed the gaff toward the ridge. "Another mile. Can you walk it?" I could walk it. My body was stiff and my breath was short from the climb, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Adrenaline, probably, or the strangeness of proximity to another person after 45 days, but I could walk. We climbed the ridge in silence. The forest was dense spruce, with an understory of fern and moss sound dampening, visibility limiting. She moved through it without disturbing anything. I crashed behind her, like a man who'd forgotten how Earth works. Her house appeared through the trees, a single-story structure with a green metal roof and a wraparound deck set into the slope so that the rear wall was half buried in the hillside. Solar panels on the roof, a rain barrel at each corner, a small fenced garden harvested, the soil turned and mulched beside the south-facing wall. She stopped at the deck stairs and turned. "Ground rules. You stay as long as you're useful and no longer than you want. You sleep in the mudroom. You eat what I eat. You don't touch my tools without asking, and you don't go below the ridgeline without telling me where. Okay? And you tell me what your actual skill is. Not what you did for money, what you can do with your hands that keeps things standing." "I'm a mason. Marine structures, stone and mortar." Something shifted in her face. Not quite approval, recognition maybe. "My well casing is cracked. I've been losing water for 3 weeks. Can you fix a well casing?" "What material?" "Granite blocks, dry stacked, 19th century. "Yes, I can fix that." "Then you can stay." 3 days passed on Brid's Ridge before I understood the shape of her survival. She had been a lobster woman. 31 years on the water, running traps off the outer islands, maintaining her own boat, her own gear, her own schedule. Her husband, Ira Selwick, had been a marine biologist who studied lobster populations for the State Fisheries Department. They'd lived on the ridge for 19 years. I heard the name and everything in my chest went still. Ira Selwick. Not my Ira, the surname hit me like a rogue wave. But the first name was coincidence. It had to be coincidence. My Ira's last name was different. My Ira was a diver, not a biologist. My Ira had no wife on a ridge in Maine. But the name sat in me like a stone dropped into the cistern of my lighthouse mind, the plunk, and then the silence after, and the knowledge that the water level had changed. I said nothing. I fixed her well casing. The work was straightforward. 3 of the dry stacked granite blocks had shifted, opening gaps where groundwater seeped out rather than rising to the draw point. I reset the stones, shimmed them with slate offcuts I found in her tool shed, and mixed a lime mortar from materials she had stored. She'd been planning the repair herself before the outbreak made procurement impossible. While I worked, she told me about the 45 days from her perspective. She'd seen the outbreak start from the ridge, had watched, through binoculars, the town of Buckfeld come apart over the course of a single afternoon. Her husband had been in town. She'd watched the roads fill with vehicles and then empty of vehicles and then fill with things that weren't driving. She'd waited 2 days for him to come home. On day 3, she'd gone down to look. She'd found his truck at the hardware store with the door open and the keys in the ignition and blood on the steering wheel. She hadn't found him. "I don't know if he's down there," she said, meaning the crowd at the shore. I stopped looking with the binoculars after the first week. It doesn't help to look for a specific face in that. I understood. I thought of the red jacket I'd seen from the gallery, the one that might have been the diner woman, and how I'd stopped looking at details after day 10. "The lighthouse was smart," she said. "For one person, you could have lasted months. The mortar was cracking. Everything cracks. You fix it." She said this without judgment. A practical observation from a woman who'd spent 31 years maintaining gear and boat and traps in an ocean that broke everything eventually. "I wasn't staying because it was safe," I said. The words came out before I decided to say them. She looked at me, that assessing look again. "I know," she said. "I could tell by the way you never turned on the big light. Someone who wanted rescue would have turned on the light." On the 7th day at Brid's Ridge, someone knocked on her door. Not the dead, we were 800 vertical feet above the shore, and in 7 weeks, none of them had climbed this high. They seemed drawn downhill, toward water, toward the shore, toward the shelf where the lighthouse sat. The ridge was outside their pattern. The knock was human. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced, followed by a voice. "Anyone home? I can see your chimney smoke." Brid was at the door before I'd fully processed the sound. She moved like a woman who'd been expecting this, not this specific visit, but the inevitability of being found. She took the gaff from its hook by the door, opened it 6 inches, and looked out. "I see you," she said. "Step back off the deck." I came up behind her and looked over her shoulder. A man stood in the clearing below the deck stairs. Mid-40s, thin, wearing a canvas jacket over layers of flannel. He had a backpack and a walking stick and the face of someone who'd been sleeping outdoors for a long time. "Name's Bascom Plews," he said. "I'm coming from Buckfeld. I'm not sick. I'm not armed. I'm looking for the lighthouse keeper." Both Brid and I went still. "Why?" Brid said. "Because Angus Tidewell told me to. 3 weeks ago, before he died. He said whoever was keeping the Cape Morrow light would be the one person on this coast who knew the water well enough to get us out by boat. Tidwell, the harbor master, the man who'd walked past my scaffold on day one, carrying a radio and a shotgun, alive for 3 weeks after that, alive long enough to tell someone about me. "Who's us?" Brid said. 12 people, holed up in the Buckfeld fish plant. We've got walls and we've got food. The cold storage is still running on its own diesel system. But we've got no way off the coast. Roads are gone. Bridges are gone. The only way out is water. He looked up at the house, squinting against the morning light. Tidwell said there was a man who knew the tides and the currents and the stone who'd worked every mile of coast from here to Portland. He said find the Lighthouse man. I stood behind Brid and felt the weight of this like ballast shifting in a hull. 12 people in a fish plant. Tidwell alive and thinking in his last weeks about how to save them, sending this man to find me, who'd spent 45 days in a stone tower doing nothing, helping no one, watching the dead accumulate from a safe distance and feeling relieved about it. Brid turned and looked at me. "Your call," she said. Nothing more. I thought about the lighthouse, about the narrowing, about the morning I decided to leave, not to help anyone, not to rejoin the world, but because the mortar was cracking and the math had turned against my solitude. I'd left for myself. I'd always done things for myself. But the mortar in the fish plant was cracking too. 12 people against a growing crowd, with walls and food, but no exit. And I knew the water. I knew the tides. I knew the coast. "The harbor's gone," I said. "Full of them. You can't launch from Buckfeld." "I know," Pluce said. "That's why Tidwell said to find you. He said you'd know another way." And I did. 3 miles east, around the headland, there was a private dock built into a sheltered cove, the same dock I'd restored 4 years ago. It was accessible only by a trail through the ridge forest. The cove was deep enough for a working vessel, sheltered from the open Atlantic by 2 granite arms that formed a natural breakwater. Brid's lobster boat was at that dock. I'd seen it from her deck, the mooring line visible in the cove below when the light was right. She'd never mentioned it. I'd never asked. I looked at her now. "Your boat?" "Still there," she said. "Still fueled. I checked it last week." "Can it take 12 people?" 14, if they sit on the deck and don't move much. She's a 42-foot Westmac. She'll hold. I looked at Pluce. I looked at Brid. I looked at the forest stretching downhill toward the coast where the dead gathered. And the fish plant held 12 people I'd never met, sent to me by a dead man who'd believed I was worth finding. "I'll need a day to plan the route," I said. "Getting 12 people from the fish plant to this cove without using roads. It's all ridge trail and forest. 3 miles, but steep." Pluce nodded. "I can get back to them by tonight if I leave now. Tell them to be ready?" "Tomorrow night, low tide. I'll meet them at the fish plant's east loading dock at 2200. He looked at me for a long moment. "Tidwell said you'd help." "Tidwell didn't know me. He knew you were still keeping the light. He said only a certain kind of man keeps a light. Nobody needs." Pluce turned and walked into the forest and disappeared down the ridge. And I stood on Brid's deck and felt something I hadn't felt in 45 days. The terrible, specific weight of other people's lives, depending on whether I showed up. The next 30 hours were the most focused work of my life. I spent the afternoon with Brid, mapping the route from the fish plant to the cove. She knew the trail system, decades of walking these ridges, and she drew the path on a topographic map from her husband's study with a certainty that left no room for doubt. 3 miles of ridge trail, climbing 600 feet in the first mile, then level for 1.5, then descending steeply to the cove. The critical problem wasn't distance or terrain. It was noise. 12 people moving through forest at night would make noise. The dead below the ridgeline would hear. If enough of them oriented uphill toward the sound, the trail would become impassable. The wind, Brid said. Offshore wind after midnight. Carries sound seaward, not inland. We go when the wind is right. I checked her weather instruments, a barometer, a wind vane on the roof peak, a thermometer. The forecast tools of a lobster woman who'd spent 31 years reading weather by analog means. She predicted offshore wind beginning around 2300. We'd launch the group at 2200, climb the first mile to the ridge, the hardest, loudest part, and by the time they were on the level section, the wind would be carrying their noise toward open ocean. What about the fish plant to the trailhead? I asked. That's your problem. You know the waterfront. I don't go below the ridge. I did know the waterfront. The fish plant sat on the eastern edge of Buckfeld Harbor, separated from the main waterfront by a breakwater and a maintenance road. The trailhead, an old timber company access point, was 1/2 mile east of the plant, at the base of the ridge where the spruce began. 1/2 mile of open ground between 12 people in the forest. I would need a distraction. Not noise. Noise would draw them toward us. The opposite. I needed to draw them away. Toward the western waterfront, toward the harbor center, away from the fish plant's east side. I thought about this for hours. And then I thought about the lighthouse. The big light. The Fresnel lens I'd never turned on. Still functional, I'd maintained it obsessively as part of my ritual of keeping. It would throw a beam visible for 20 miles. And it sat on the western side of the promontory, visible from the western shore, visible from the harbor, visible from everywhere the dead had gathered over 6 weeks of staring at my tower. If I turned it on, every one of them, the 100+ at the shelf edge, the crowd along the western shore, the ones in the harbor would orient toward it. A beam sweeping the darkness, rhythmic, visible, impossible to ignore for things that seemed drawn to light and pattern. It would pull them west, away from the fish plant, away from the trailhead. I could time it with the tide. Turn the light on at 2200 when the shelf was exposed. They'd walk toward it. Dozens, maybe all of them. Toward the lighthouse, across the shelf, drawn by the lamp they'd been watching for 6 weeks. And while they walked west, 12 people would walk east into the forest, up the ridge, to the cove where Brid's boat waited. You'd have to go back, Brid said, reading my face. Back to the lighthouse to turn it on. I know the tower. I can get in and out. Can you get in and out with 100 of them at the base? The eastern shelf. Same way I left. They mass on the western side. I go around. She was quiet for a long time. Then, you'd be using the lighthouse as bait. Yes. The place you spent 45 days. The place you maintained like it was alive. Yes. She studied me. That assessment again, but different now. Not calculating whether I was useful. Calculating whether I was serious. Okay, she said. I'll have the boat ready. You get the light on and you get those 12 people to my cove by midnight. I'll run them east to Portland Harbor. There's a naval station there, or there was. Either way, it's away from here. I nodded. I picked up my pack. I checked the tide chart, low tide at 2147. The shelf would be exposed. I could cross the eastern route in the dusk, enter the tower from the gallery using the handholds I knew, reach the lamp room and turn on the light, then descend the same way, cross back, and reach the fish plant by 2200. The timing was impossible unless everything worked perfectly. Everything would need to work perfectly. "Jonah," Brid said as I stepped off the deck. I turned. "Angus Tidewell was my uncle," she said. "He told Plews to find the Lighthouse man because he'd been watching you for years, working on his breakwater, his harbor wall, his lighthouse. He said you were the most careful man he'd ever seen with stone. He said you never left a joint unfinished." I stared at her. Tidewell. Her uncle. Watching me work for 4 years without ever mentioning a niece on the ridge. "He thought you'd help," she said, "because he'd seen you maintain things nobody asked you to maintain. He thought that meant something." I didn't know if it meant something. I'd maintained the lighthouse because maintenance was easier than thinking. I'd kept the lamp working because machinery was simpler than people. I'd fixed mortar joints because stone didn't die if you looked away for 14 seconds. But I was walking downhill now, toward the coast, toward 12 people I'd never met, toward the tower I'd locked myself inside for 45 days, while the world needed things from people, and I gave nothing. The lighthouse would be bait tonight, and tomorrow it would be empty. And I would be on a boat with 14 people whose lives depended on my knowledge of tides and currents and the patience of stone. The light would draw them in, and I would lead the living out. The same tower, 2 different purposes. The only difference was whether the door was bolted from inside or from outside. I'd finally chosen outside. The crossing worked. Not perfectly, nothing works perfectly when you're moving 12 terrified people through dark forest with the offshore wind masking their stumbling and the distant lighthouse beam pulling the dead westward like a tide of its own. Plews lost a shoe in the first mile of ridge trail. A woman named Kara fell on the descent and twisted her knee and was carried the last quarter mile by a man whose name I never learned. A boy of about 9 refused to walk for 200 meters and had to be lifted and held against someone's chest. But they reached the cove. Brid had the engine running. 14 people boarded a 42-foot lobster boat in 11 minutes, and by 030, we were past the breakwater arms and running east in open Atlantic water, the lighthouse beam still sweeping behind us, visible for 20 miles, holding the dead's attention like a promise nobody would keep. I watched it until it dropped below the horizon. My tower, my sentence, my 61 feet of granite and iron and lime mortar and silence. The place where I'd learned that safety without obligation isn't peace. It's just a slower way of drowning. I keep the light now, not that one. A different one, a lantern on the bow of Brid's boat, which runs the coast twice weekly between survivor points, carrying supplies and passengers and news. A small light, nothing dramatic, nothing visible for 20 miles. Just enough to say, I am here, I am paying attention. I will not look away for 14 seconds. Tidewell was wrong about me. I wasn't careful with stone because I cared about maintenance. I was careful with stone because stone couldn't die. Stone couldn't call for help. Stone couldn't slip underwater while I argued about an invoice. But he was right about one thing. I never left a joint unfinished. And the joint between myself and the rest of the world, the one I'd let crack open 7 months before the outbreak, and had spent 45 days pretending didn't need repair, that joint is mortared now. Not perfectly. Lime mortar never cures perfectly. It stays slightly flexible. It moves with the structure. It breathes. That's enough. That's the only kind of repair that holds.